I think we're already in a collapse. I mean, the country is facing ridiculously high inflation and interest rates, and as I mentioned, I don't believe that the economic statistics are true. I think that they're already going through a collapse. It doesn't mean that just because his economy is not doing well, that he's going to be overthrown. What it does mean, though, is the worse his economy does, the less money he has. Eventually, he just doesn't have the money to do all the terrible things he's doing from a war standpoint.
Hello and welcome to the Times Radio Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're talking to an old friend of the show, Sir William Browder, who's the CEO of Armitage Capital, head of the Magnitsky Justice Campaign, and author of Red Notice and Freezing Order, and an old friend of the show. Sir William, Bill, welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
Now, looking at the year, the economic battle has been something that has been playing out in the background often and is coming more into the foreground as Zelensky imposes physical sanctions on Russia. But as of mid-December 25, the economic war has entered a sort of point of exhaustion for the Kremlin. From my perspective, I'd love to know your perspective. And despite the surface level appearance of resilience, the Russian central bank has just reported growth slowing to near zero, whilst the EU, and that was at December the 12th to the 15th, moved to make the freeze on Russian assets indefinite. The breaking point of military Keynesism for 2 years has fueled growth through massive state spending on tanks and missiles in Russia. But with the central bank reporting that zero growth rate, where is it going? What's happening? What will be going through Putin's mind at the moment?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that whatever Russia reports, you should assume is a lie. So if they're reporting a 0% growth rate, I would knock 2, 3, 4 percentage points off of that, because these people don't tell the truth. They have a history of lying, and why should we believe a word that they say? The second thing that's going on is that the Russian people are suffering. We worry about inflation of 3 or 4%. They've got inflation of 15%. And it's not as if wages are going up in line with inflation. So the average Russian is getting 15% worse off. And we all know what happens in a society when people get worse off, when they're basically getting a demotion or a decline in their standard of living. They get angry. And so the Russian people are angry. There's no way that you can get around that. And then on top of that, in spite of hesitation by the West, and particularly the United States, on punishing Russia with more sanctions, Vladimir Zelensky has decided to take matters into his own hands, and he's sanctioning Russia. How is he doing that? That he's figured out how to use long-range drones to hit oil refineries, and they've, I think, depending on whose numbers you believe, they've taken somewhere between 20 and 30% of oil refining capacity off the Russian market. It's led to shortage of Russian gasoline in a lot of regions. They've used their drones to disrupt air travel in Russia for 12 hours at a time. All airports in Moscow get closed down. And then they've used their drones to go after the Shadow Fleet. The Shadow Fleet is the fleet of 30-year-old tankers that the Russians bought to try to bypass the oil sanctions. And as of now, the Ukrainians have used the drones to immobilize two empty tankers that were in the Black Sea, and one off the coast of Senegal. And it's not just those three tankers that are immobilized, but a lot of other tankers and the people who are operating them are afraid to take on oil and afraid to go into Russian ports because they may be next. In the same way that the Ukrainian Navy, and they don't have a Navy, has pretty much destroyed or incapacitated the Russian Navy, the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The same thing, I believe, is happening with the Shadow Fleet. And then, as you mentioned, the any hope that Russia was going to get back their central bank reserves has now been fully dashed by the decision that the European Council took earlier this week, which basically said that from now on, there doesn't need to be a renewal of sanctions every 6 months. and therefore the frozen assets in Europe are going to stay frozen until the war ends. So I would say that Putin is he might be talking a big game. He can do that very easily. He's personally not suffering, but the Russians are suffering, and so he's faced with a real dilemma, which is what does he do in a situation where people are getting angry with him? If he was in a democracy, he would be voted out a long time ago. He's not in a democracy; he's in a dictatorship. But even in a dictatorship, you got to worry about a million people storming the Kremlin, and so his only choice right now is to repress further, and the other only choice he has is to keep everybody in a state of nationalistic fervor, which means being at war, continuing at war. And so any idea that the war is going to end with some negotiation between Steve Witkoff and the Ukrainians is ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that Putin doesn't want to end the war.
Well, that's where we are now. So let's go back to January 2025. What has changed over the year from your perspective as you've analysed it? And does that put Putin in a stronger position, a weaker position? Is it affecting the Russian people more than today than it did back in January of this year? What's your view?
Well, so there's two parallel things going on. There's the pain that Russia is suffering, and I would argue that the pain has increased. So, for example, before February of this year, President Biden was the president of the United States. He supplied military aid to Ukraine, and in exchange for that, he had a say over how the Ukrainian military executed their war, and he told them, "Don't hit targets inside of Russia." Donald Trump comes in. He says, I'm not going to supply any more military aid to Ukraine. Therefore, he's not in a position to tell the Ukrainians what they can and can't do. And so as a result of that, while the Ukrainians need more military aid, they're not getting it from the Americans, but they can use whatever the resources they have, and they have their own resources to do all this attacking refineries and attacking all sorts of other stuff in Russia. They took out many of long-range bombers in an audacious attack called Operation Spiderweb, where they took out I believe like 25% of all the long-range bombers, like thousands of kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Now, so on one side, the Ukrainians have gained some advantage, which has caused pain in Russia. But the one thing I can say, and this is really important, is that we live in a democracy. We live in a democracy in the UK, and all the allies live in democracies in Europe. And the problem with democracies is that we can only experience a tiny fraction of the pain that Putin is experiencing before everybody starts flapping around and saying, we don't want to spend any more money, we don't want to support Ukraine, etc. Putin lives in a dictatorship. In a dictatorship, it doesn't matter what people are thinking. And so I would argue that Putin can experience 100 times the pain that we experience in UK or in Europe, and that's okay. And so he's got this one huge advantage in spite of all the terrible things that are happening to him, which is that time is on his side because he's a dictator versus us in a democracy. And so I've seen the sands shifting in all sorts of places. The Italians who are sort of all in helping and supporting Ukraine have started grumbling about it. And of course, we've seen the Czech Republic, which was firmly on the side of Ukraine. Government changed there. They have a new president who seems to be on the side of Russia. And so it's a complicated situation from our side. Putin's got the advantage just because he's a dictator. He doesn't have to worry about change of population's views on him as long as they're scared of him. Whereas we're just in a constantly changing world where one of 27 EU member states can change from pro-Ukraine to pro-Russia and so on and so forth.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned some of the changes in relationships that there are with European countries. If we go back to the beginning of the year, with Joe Biden, it seemed to be that he didn't want to make a decision that would escalate the conflict and bring threat to the United States. Donald Trump has come in and he seems to flip-flop between whether he's supporting what Zelensky's coming out with, if it's underpinned by the European nations or the coalition, the willing coming and whispering in his ear, to then he has a conversation with Steve Witkoff, who's just been off to Moscow, and then he has a conversation with Vladimir Putin, and he seems to change completely. Do you think Vladimir Putin is sitting there behind his big oak desk in Moscow with a very large glass of best Russian vodka over ice and a big white cat on his knee, stroking it, going, I'm doing what I want to do and creating division in the West, and I've got control of the United States because I'm stopping them making any decisions that are going to have an immediate impact on me?
Well, I mean, he must be thanking his lucky stars that Donald Trump became the president of the United States. Because I disagree with you on one characterization. I don't think that there's any flip flopping. I think that Donald Trump has firmly thrown his lot in with Vladimir Putin. He's trying to do so in a difficult environment in which to do that in, because it's against the will of the American people. I think if you look at surveys of Americans, I think like 83% of them support Ukraine, and the other 17% don't support Putin. They just don't. They just don't support Ukraine. And of course, he's basically doing a 180-degree U-turn on 80 years of U.S. policy, and particularly Republican policy. And so he can't do it sort of as overtly as he'd probably like to do it, but he's getting pretty overt right now. I mean, he's come out with some outlandish statements saying that Ukraine should have never started the war. Um, I mean, he was the one who ended U.S. military aid for Ukraine. Whatever nonsense he mumbles from day to day about a peace treaty, he stopped funding Ukraine, and now he's trying to use whatever leverage he has left, which is not that much. He doesn't have that much leverage, but he's trying to use whatever leverage he has left to force a deal that would benefit Putin. The leverage that he has left is he does continue, or the U.S. continues to supply military intelligence to Ukraine, which is very valuable. They can tell the Ukrainians when a missile has been launched or when troops are being moved, which is very valuable military intelligence. And the one thing, or two things that he's doing in relation to the allies, which are quite pernicious, is he's threatening NATO, effectively NATO involvement in Europe if the Europeans continue to support Ukraine, and he's also threatening the Europeans with various consequences if the Europeans confiscate the Russian central bank reserves. And so Donald Trump, I think, by any objective measure, is on the side of Vladimir Putin right now. And the question is does he have enough leverage left to force Ukraine and to force Europe into a catastrophic capitulation?
Well, it's interesting. Donald Trump keeps talking about the art of the deal, and everything's about a deal. But economics well. Why is he focusing on a country that's got a GDP of what, 2.3 trillion, 2.6 trillion, Russia, and alienating the EU, which is 200 trillions worth of countries that he could potentially be doing deals with, and then as he sets up and forces Europe to step up in its defense industries, in the future they're only going to compete with US defense industries elsewhere in the world, and he's knocked the confidence of that down. He seems to be doing everything that is potentially going to hurt the United States in the long run. What sort of hold does Putin have over him to force him to do that?
Well, so I spent, before I got involved in human rights activism, I was an investor, and as an investor, I ran a large investment fund. There was a saying that everybody behaves rationally, and if somebody is doing something which appears irrational, you just don't have all the information. And so what information don't we have that which would explain this? So what could Trump be hoping for or getting in this situation? And the answer is that he's been pretty transparent about it. He took a $400 million gold-plated 747 from the Qataris, and all of a sudden he's setting up Qatari Air Force training centers in America. I mean, it's pretty obvious that he's hoping for some type of Similar thing from Vladimir Putin. We don't know what that is. We don't know in what form it will take. We don't know. Maybe it already has taken place. But the Europeans are not going to give him an Airbus, $1 billion Airbus. We don't do that kind of stuff in Europe. But Vladimir Putin is perfectly capable of that. And so, there's a pretty strong pattern at this point of Trump looking for personal advantage. He's been given immunity from the Supreme Court for any action he takes as president. So I don't think he's worried about any kind of legal blowback. And I think he's hoping for some personal gain from this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, one area where Putin will be smarting over, not necessarily personal gain, but some of his assets being taken away is you started talking about it, but the Euroclear legal war, where Russia is now taking the Belgian clearance bank to court, and I think it's a Russian court, over to try and stop them from taking the frozen Russian assets and using them for Ukraine. And Belgium seems to be quite nervous about all of this. What's your take of what's going on in what seems to be quite a complex legal debate and battle that's going on at the moment?
Well, I don't think there's anything complex about it at all. So Russia launched a war of aggression and violated the sovereignty of Ukraine and has caused somewhere between 500 billion and $1 trillion of damage to Ukraine. I think that's a matter of fact. When the war started, the West froze $300 billion of central bank reserves that belong to the government of Russia.
And that's Vladimir Putin, essentially. It belongs to him and his oligarchs.
Well, it belongs to the government of Russia, who the government of Russia is responsible for the invasion of Ukraine. And so on any legal basis, there's damages that are due to Ukraine, and we have the funds to satisfy those damages. So Vladimir Putin is running around like Chicken Little saying, well, if you do that, you're violating all rules, because in theory, his money is supposed to be protected by what's called sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity means that your embassy can't be taken away and supposedly your central bank reserves can't be taken away. Well, that doesn't quite work if he's violated the sovereign immunity of Ukraine by taking 20% of their country. And so he can't have it both ways. Now, he can launch a lawsuit all he wants in Moscow court, and that means absolutely nothing. Just for example, the Russian government launched a lawsuit against Google, and I think they won damages of a number that's greater than a Google, which is a number with so many zeros you can't even count. But that doesn't mean anything. It's not like they're going to be able to enforce that judgment. I think what's going on with Belgium is pretty straightforward. We've learned from a blockbuster article in a small newspaper called the EU Observer that the Russian government had threatened the life of the CEO of Euroclear. And I would be very surprised if the Russian government, if Vladimir Putin, hadn't threatened the life of the Belgian prime minister. And that's why he's objecting to this whole thing. He has one argument about why he doesn't want to do this, which is a reasonable argument, which is that why should Belgium take the heat from Russia when there will be heat by itself? And that argument has been, I believe, satisfied by the rest of the European Union that says that has signed an agreement saying we'll all take the heat together. But I believe, and I'm almost sure of this, that he's been threatened, and that's why he's so against it. And I don't think that the entire security of Europe should be sacrificed because one prime minister is scared. I think that we should figure out a way to protect the prime minister of Belgium so he doesn't get assassinated. And then we should protect the rest of Europe so we don't end up with 1 million young Europeans dead in a war with Russia in the next 10 years.
Well, that makes infinite sense. But talking of cost, there must be a personal cost to Putin in all of this. You've long argued that Putin's wealth is held by trustees, and that's his oligarchs. And as the Russian economy shrinks and the carrots for these elites disappear, they can't use their private jets. Their boats have been impounded and sold. They can't have their families going off overseas and living the high life and everything else. So as they disappear, surely the economic pressure will finally turn into sticks being forced at Putin himself. Or do you think Putin's got himself in such a secure bubble that that's not going to happen?
Putin is absolutely not worried about any oligarchs turning against him. These guys are such a bunch of cowards. Really sort of beta males when it comes to Putin. They're all just like prostrating themselves in front of him, hoping that he will be nice to them. I mean, he's a truly psychopathic, ruthless person, and they're all just so scared of him. So he doesn't have to worry about that. But what I would say is interesting is that Russia doesn't count their dead. They don't care how many people are dead. I should say Vladimir Putin doesn't care how many people are dead. But money has got infinite value to them, and they count their money. And so the idea that Europe could take away their money is something very, very upsetting to Vladimir Putin. And I believe that a lot of the noise around all this 28-point peace negotiation stuff is just purely a way to sort of muddy the waters, to throw some obscurity into the process, so that he can somehow prevent this money from being confiscated, and he can somehow prevent the Chinese, Indian, and Turkish oil refineries from being punished for buying Russian oil, which is the main source of income. If he can avoid those two things with these supposed peace negotiations going on, then he's achieved a lot. And he's also achieved something even more important, which is he's bought himself time in a moment in time when we don't have a lot of time on our side, because everybody is busy arguing among themselves and saying, how long should we do this for, etc.
Yeah, well, he's very good at that. But what do you think Putin's reaction will be if the Europeans finally decide to take the $300 billion and give it to Ukraine?
He will huff and he will puff, and that will be the end of it. As he's huffed and he's puffed about long-range missiles and tanks and F-16s and all sorts of other stuff, there's nothing he can do. He will make some kind of token efforts, but it's not as if we have an equivalent amount of money deposited at the Central Bank of Russia. We don't keep our reserves in Russia. He keeps his reserves in the West. That money has been already frozen, and that money will be confiscated. And there's no reciprocal thing he can do. And for what it's worth, he's already doing all the asymmetrical things that he can do. He's cutting internet cables to the Baltics. He's sending drones into Poland. He's sending assassins to various countries to kill his enemies. And so it's not like if we don't take that money, he'll behave himself. He's doing all this stuff anyways. We're already at war with this guy. It's an asymmetric war. It's a hybrid war, but it's a war nonetheless. And we should be behaving in a tough way with him. And given that he values money so much, that's the one thing we can really do to hit him hard, hit him right between the eyes.
So your first prediction for 2026 is Putin huffing and puffing. Many economists are predicting a hard landing for Russia through 2026. As the Soviet-era equipment stockpiles run dry and they have to start building from scratch, high interest rates, and they're going higher. Do you foresee the possibility of there being a 1990s-style economic collapse for Russia through 2026, or even out into early 2027?
Well, I mean, so there's two questions. Will there be a collapse? And what will that collapse mean for Putin and his ability to carry on with all the nastiness he's doing? And I think we're already in a collapse. I mean, the country is facing ridiculously high inflation and interest rates, and as I mentioned, I don't believe that the economic statistics are true. I think that they're already going through a collapse. But the one thing I would say is that we should never bet that hardship on Russia will lead to a change in policy. And the reason for that is that in the same way as it doesn't lead to a change in policy in North Korea, Vladimir Putin has gone from a sort of hard president to an authoritarian president to a totalitarian president, and he's ready to go further. And it doesn't mean that the Russian people are going to rise up. The Russian people at some point may, but he's operating on the assumption that they won't. And so it doesn't mean that just because his economy is not doing well, that he's going to be overthrown. What it does mean, though, is the worse his economy does, the less money he has, eventually he just doesn't have the money to do all the terrible things he's doing from a war standpoint. They're spending a lot of money on weapons. If they run out of money, people aren't going to sell them weapons for free. The soldiers that are going into battle are being paid a lot of money. At the moment, they don't have a general conscription. The reason they don't have a general conscription is that Putin understands how unpopular that would be, and so they're like effectively bribing poor people to go and kill themselves on the front. And that's been working so far. If they run out of money, they'll have to do a general conscription. If they do that, then he faces even more pressure from angry people who aren't happy. But does that mean the whole thing blows sky high and he loses his power? Nobody knows.
Well, that means that 2026 once again is going to be an interesting year. Sir William Browder, Bill, it's been fascinating talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Times Radio Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, if you want more on the war in Ukraine, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for membership to get you exclusive content and allow you to ask questions back to me. And remember, Frontline is also available in podcast form. You can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Times Radio Frontline.